Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Foreign Correspondents Club here in Hong Kong on a very special day. Today is World Press Freedom Day. And on this event, we are very honored here to have Asia's press clubs for another one of our FCC online Zoom events. This year has been an extremely tough one for press freedom in the region and indeed beyond, with attacks on journalists, including by police, proliferation of fake news laws, online harassment, especially against female reporters, and weaponization of libel laws and other existing criminal codes against people of our profession. Nowhere has this trend been bleaker than here in Asia, where according to Reporters Without Borders, among 180 countries, only South Korea and Taiwan place among the top 50. Hong Kong has dropped dramatically from its place at the handover in 1997, now ranking at number 80, and most of the ASEAN countries, including Indonesia, Thailand, the Philippines, Cambodia, and Myanmar, rank close to the bottom. So in this event, we are lucky to have with us representatives from these clubs and indeed from the media across Asia. We have with us Ed Davies, who's currently the Southeast Asia news editor for Reuters and president of the Jakarta Foreign Correspondents Club. Ed has spent more than 2 decades reporting from the Asia Pacific region, including 2 stints in Indonesia. We have Ate Hoekstra, a freelance correspondent based in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, and part of the Foreign Correspondents Club there. He covers Thailand, Myanmar, Vietnam, and Laos, mainly for the Dutch daily newspapers and other Asia-based online magazines. We have Barnaby Low, a freelance foreign correspondent based in Manila, Philippines, representing the FOCAP, Foreign Correspondents Club there. He reports and produces for CBS News and Al Jazeera English, and also contributes regularly to China's global television network, CGTN. And last but not least, we have Gwen Robinson, editor-in-large of Nikkei Asia, and a veteran of reporting here in Asia. And Gwen is based in Bangkok, where she is a past president of the Foreign Correspondents Club of Thailand. And moderating us will be our own FCC President, Keith Richburg. And I'm just going to pass you on to Keith to take it away. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Shabani. And thank you all panelists for being here. I really, I'm very thankful for all of you being here for this important day, Press Freedom Day, World Press Freedom Day. As Shabani was going around the region introducing you all, I realized how jealous I was that I had not been able to travel for the last year or so to come to all of your capitals to write about things. I miss Bangkok, Gwen. I miss the Philippines, Barnaby. I miss Cambodia, Ate. I miss Vietnam. I miss a lot of these places. So hopefully within the next year or so, we'll get to go see each other in person. But what I thought we would do, if it's okay with you guys, is just do a little round robin first. If everybody could just take 5 minutes and let's just go around and find out what's happening in the regions, your region, your patch, in terms of press freedom, in terms of anything we should know about, in terms of fires on the horizon that we should know about. Let's just go in kind of the order, in alphabetical order. And Ed Davies, can we start with you, because you cover Indonesia? Can you tell us what's happening? And I should say that I covered Indonesia. I was there during the fall of Suharto in 1998, and when I left, I thought Indonesia was kind of on a path towards a pretty free press, and it probably was going to take over in the region as the place with the freest press. But it's a good time to say what's happening now. Tell us what's happening now.
Well, I think now, what's happened is it's sort of glass half full. It's been labeled by Freedom House as partially free, while Reporters Without Borders, it did improve slightly its ranking to 119th, but I think it hasn't had the sort of bigger bump that many expected under the Jokowi presidency. One area is the Electronic Information and Transactions Laws, which regulates activities of defamation, hate speech. That's drawn a lot of criticism for its broad interpretation. One egregious case was a woman in Lombok who was jailed for 6 months after recording a phone conversation with her boss to prove he was sexually harassing her, and that was later shared online, and she was jailed. But I suppose in an encouraging move, she was later pardoned, and but there's sort of cases ensnared journalists, academics, and opposition figures. And then there's Papua, which remains a sensitive issue, particularly for foreign media. And that's despite Jokowi's initial declaration that it would be as free as other parts of Indonesia to visit. In reality, there have been issues when trips have taken place. I think a BBC team was expelled after tweets that the military took offense to. And then after an outbreak of civil unrest in 2019, entry to foreign media and in fact, many diplomats too was completely halted for a while. Also, we've had issues with the internet access being blocked for a time. This happened in Papua, and it also happened during some riots that happened after the 2019 election in Jakarta. And the government says this is needed to control sharing on social media of fake news and the like, but obviously for rights activists, there's the big concern. And we've also reported on quite a lot of this at Reuters. So look, you know, there are quite a few issues still going on. I mean, I think it's neither as dire as maybe you were suggesting it might have been, or as good as it could have been. So plenty of work probably still to do in Indonesia. And one positive thing, we have a very lively local journalist scene, which, you know, who we communicate a lot at the Jakarta Foreign Correspondents Club, and they're definitely, you know, active, although they are suffering during the pandemic, clearly. So I think with that, I'll move on, not to take up too much of our brief time.
Thank you for that. And Ed, if I could just keep you for 1 second. What,
Sure.
is there any situation with foreign journalists who need visas to come into Indonesia? Has that been a problem at all?
It can certainly be a problem. I mean, I think for instance, there was a Manga Bay journalist who was detained in Borneo over visa violations. He had a business visa, and you know, effectively that could have meant up to 5 years in jail. I think some of these issues sometimes come about when people find it difficult or lengthy to get a visa with some red tape in that area. But yeah, you know, it remains an issue. I think other issues are that sometimes foreign correspondents are deciding to base in Singapore rather than base in Indonesia, and people are broadly looking at the region and deciding where to go. And if it takes longer to get a visa, then you know, sometimes they'll take that decision. And of course, the whole pandemic has probably accelerated that type of trend.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for that. We'll get back to you, Ed. We'll have a lot more questions. Stay where you are. Let's move on to Cambodia, where I spent a lot of time there in the 90s, the 80s and the 90s. And Ate Hoekstra, you're there now. Apparently, Hun Sen's the longest serving leader, I think, in the region, if not the world. And he has now said he's going to stay there forever. But what has that meant for journalists? What has that meant for journalism? What has that meant for independent media in Cambodia?
Well, things have changed a lot over the past couple of years. I mean, I've been here since 2012, and back then Cambodia was still had a very free media landscape, much freer than it is now. But especially over the past 4 years, things have changed. We saw some independent newspapers who were either forced to shut down or to take a more government-friendly course. We also saw that Radio Free Asia, for example, they had to shut down their office in 2017 after 20 years of operating in the country. And we've also seen like a number of journalists who were detained and who were charged and accused, for example, of espionage, which happened in the case of 2 Radio Free Asia journalists. And that was in 2017, and their case is still basically ongoing. They have been released on bail, but the case is still at court, and they could be arrested any day again. So there's a lot of things that have changed over those past 4 years, and it really seems that the government is trying to make it more difficult, especially for the independent media. And there's a lot of new laws as well. And what we also see, of course, in other parts of the region, laws against fake news, for example. And often what happens in Cambodia quite often is that not just journalists, but also human rights activists and labor activists and land rights activists are being arrested and then accused of incitement to commit a felony. It's a very popular charge that is being used, and that is leading to a lot of concern among many journalists, because it's also creating more of an atmosphere of fear and creating more self-censorship. That is, yeah, things have definitely gotten much more difficult over the past few years.
Mhm. And Ate, may I ask you? We've heard this phrase around the region floating around: fake news. Anything that the government doesn't like or authoritarian regimes don't like suddenly becomes fake news. Have you heard Hun Sen or his allies within the government using this phrase "fake news" to discredit legitimate reporting?
Yes, that happens. That happens. So for example, there was a case last year when a Cambodian reporter was reporting about a land issue, and then he was accused of spreading false news, and he was arrested and sent to prison. And these things happen, and Hun Sen himself as well. He's also in speeches as well. He's always reminding journalists to please report accurate news and to report the true news. And but reporting something more critical about the government is then very easily to be presented by the government, at least, as fake news.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I guess if we're going in order here, in order of difficulty of journalists, I don't know if the Philippines should come next or Thailand, but we'll go for the Philippines. I mean, it's really a toss-up.
Maybe we're ahead of Thailand now.
Yeah, you may be ahead of Thailand, so I guess we'll flip a coin.
Because of the
Barnaby,
leadership
we'll go with you next. We all know Maria Ressa is a friend of ours here at the Foreign Correspondents Club of Hong Kong, but she's the case we know about. We know a little bit about ABS-CBN's case, but update us. Let us know what's happening in the Philippines in terms of press freedom.
Right. Firstly, I want to say hi to everyone. Good evening, because I was late logging in, so I didn't have the chance to say hi to everyone, to the panelists, and to all the participants in this Zoom webinar. And happy Press Freedom Day, I guess. But I did write something up, so I hope you don't mind that I read this.
Please do.
Because just over the weekend, yesterday actually, the eve of World Press Freedom Day, police forcibly searched the home of a campus journalist at 4 a.m. Now, the journalist, his name is Justine Macias, who's also a student activist, was not home, but cops reportedly held his parents at gunpoint and then went through their belongings for 2 hours. They claim to have found a .45 caliber gun and explosives. This is not isolated. This has happened many, many times to journalists, but more so to activists here in the Philippines in the past 2 or 3 years. Now, lawyers and activists say the early morning police operation and the apparent discovery of explosives, these are hallmarks of police frame-up of personalities deemed communists by authorities. This practice is called red tagging here in the Philippines, and both activists and journalists have been victims of red tagging by the government here in the Philippines. Last year, a Manila-based journalist, Lady Ann Salem, was arrested under the exact same circumstances, but the court dismissed the case. Another young journalist, Frenchie May Cumpio, remains behind bars. Also on Sunday, a local official in the central Philippines who was a former journalist was shot to death by motorcycle riding gunmen. Now, it isn't clear what the motivation was behind the murder of John Heredia, but it underscores the culture of violence and impunity in the country. 19 journalists have been killed under the watch of President Rodrigo Duterte. That's according to the local media watchdogs. A total of 170 journalists have been killed since democracy was restored in 1986. Now, I mean, in the last decade or so, the press in the Philippines had been considered one of the freest in Asia. But the truth is, Filipino journalists have always had to contend with threats to their safety and lives. I think you will remember that back in 2009, 32 of 58 who were massacred by a political warlord in the southern Philippines were journalists. So I think that's forever going to symbolize the dangers Filipino journalists face. And now we have a president, Rodrigo Duterte, who treats the press as his enemy. The Philippine government and the independent media, of course, have never gotten along, but under Duterte, the attacks have increased, they've intensified, and he himself publicly vilifies journalists and media organizations. But social media is really where journalists have been maligned and threatened and made enemies of the state. And it doesn't stop there. And you mentioned Maria Ressa, the Rappler founder, is facing 11 court cases, from libel to cyber libel to tax evasion to violations of foreign ownership and securities laws. So, while Maria has strong support from the rest of the world, from you, her friends, she could still end up serving decades of years in prison. And then, of course, you also mentioned ABS-CBN, the Philippines' largest media conglomerate. On May 5th, 2 days from now, it will be 1 year since it went off air on free TV. Congress, just to give you a background, Congress did not renew its broadcast license because lawmakers ruled that the company violated foreign ownership laws and tax laws, even though concerned agencies had cleared the company of any wrongdoing. So the result of that is not only thousands of layoffs during a pandemic, but the loss of access to a vital source of information for many Filipinos, because ABS-CBN is often the only TV and radio station available in far-flung communities. So this is the media environment in which Filipino journalists operate in nowadays. The reach has shrunk. There are threats and lies online directed towards journalists, violence and intimidation on the ground, and a leadership that openly disparages mass media.
And Barnaby, I mean, you're a journalist there, you're on the ground. I mean, do you ever feel in danger? Do you ever feel threatened? Or do you or your crew or do anybody you work with ever feel this is a really dangerous place to be operating?
Yeah, it feels less dangerous for us working in foreign media organizations, just because we are not beholden to corporate interests here, and our companies are not also regulated in a much larger sense by the government. So for example, ABS-CBN needs to get its broadcast license from Congress every 25 years. So just like last year, they couldn't get their broadcast license because the president doesn't like them. That's the plain and simple reason. The president just doesn't like the owners of ABS-CBN. There's a longer story to that we can talk about later. I think some people might want to ask that question. But journalists who work for local media organizations, especially those who work in the provinces, they're in much greater danger than us who work in foreign media organizations. And that's why back in 1974, when FOCAP was formed, that was when the members of the foreign press came together to protect media freedom in the Philippines. And that was the only way the world knew the story of the Philippines back then.
Thank you so much. We'll get back to you. Gwen Robinson, you and I met in the Philippines. What, I don't want to date us, but was it?
Say when, Keith.
I don't want to say when, but damn, it was a lot of decades ago. Gwen Robinson. We were talking about this stuff back in the Philippines in the late 80s. But now.
Oh, I think you're going to say we covered MacArthur's return together. No.
We covered MacArthur's return. We got a lot of stuff to talk about. Gwen, I want you to talk about Thailand, and I want you to talk about Myanmar, because you are an expert. Yeah. You were with Nikkei Asian Review. I read your stuff on Myanmar. Take as much time as you need. Tell us what's going on with press freedom in both places.
Yeah, well, thanks, Keith, also for that wonderful introduction that makes me look like a museum piece. But anyway, just to look, basically sitting here in what I would call the heart of mainland Southeast Asia. So really, it's a spread across countries. And obviously, I think for all of us, the Myanmar situation has knocked everything else into insignificance. It is so dire. But I'll come back to that. I'd just like to say, I think there were some good points made, particularly recapping the year, but also to bring out very strongly how I think the whole COVID-19 pandemic has actually, provided both further impetus and an excuse for, further tightening of media, the media space, really. And that's manifested itself in different ways. But I think that is a kind of more insidious pressure on media. I was picking up on Ajay's point. I was actually reading some tweets out of Cambodia the other day. Someone was saying they had been hassled and pressured because they tweeted that they were eating rotten vegetables, and they were told not to tweet that. So, I mean, that's a kind of fairly insidious but constant, slightly sinister pressure on people, even on that simple level. But basically, looking around, I'd say that there are various forms of moves against free media in the different countries, but most of it is institutional, unlike the Philippines, where Barnaby pointed out, and we clearly can see how much of it is personality motivated and coming from Duterte and key politicians who take issue with particular journalists or media organizations. Here you've had, some of the harshest sentences, I think, in Asia at all handed down against Vietnamese journalists. 15 years, 11 years, quite a few of them locked up for very unspecified, just basically the charges are things like criticizing the state. And that happened this year and also last year. So that's kind of a party, an institutionally motivated thing. In Thailand, you've got, basically it's the reactivation of these very harsh laws against lèse majesté, criticism of the monarchy, which has resulted in almost, it's not what we're seeing in the Philippines. Killings and a lot of outright jailings of journalists. Even closures are very rare, but it's a very insidious form of threat that really has increased this tendency to self-censorship. And the reactivation of those laws, popularly known as 112, the number of the article of the Criminal Code, is really taking root and has had a huge dampening effect. But also across mainland Southeast Asia, I think both Malaysia and then going a bit further down Singapore, we've seen them bring in laws that, not directly COVID related, but laws linked to the internet and what you can spread, also linked to fake news. So overall, in that shrinking media space, along came Myanmar. And I think, it's many, many decades since we've seen such savagery. I'd even say probably back to the Khmer Rouge era in Cambodia. And as of now, I think at least 765 civilians killed, 4,560 or so have been arrested, 3,500 of those still detained, and about 1,300 warrants out against all civilians. And among all this is 70 journalists who've been arrested. At least 40 of them have been detained, and key independent media have had licenses revoked. 5 in the early weeks of the coup, but just yesterday, possibly to mark Press Freedom Day, they hit a 6th, which is a very brave Kachin newspaper up in northern Kachin state, had its license revoked. And you can see that, already journalists are basically in hiding and fearing for their lives. And so there's a lot of self-censorship. I think a lot of little publications have closed down, little operations. But incredibly, I think what we're seeing is amazing courage on the part of even journalists who are with the banned organisations are managing to, they're continuing to work by any means possible. But on top of that, and I think this is really, in some ways, it's one of the most potent examples of the power of the internet for media. It has been the junta's targeting of internet access, and we saw for weeks and weeks and weeks nightly blockage of internet that every night that lasted throughout the night. And now there's talk of other forms of blocking the internet, And I think people are largely reduced to trying to piggyback off if they can find fixed broadband lines. Wi-Fi is extremely difficult, and there's more to come. So I think really Myanmar has hit a new low, and it's been a very sobering spectacle for all of us in the region. But I'd say, and I know you wanted to ask about positive things, Keith, and out of all this, I'd say there's a lot that is positive that's come out, not just of Myanmar, but of Thailand and throughout the region, of the ways, the new creativity and the ways journalists are pushing back, finding very resourceful ways to get news out, the way they're operating. But also separate from Myanmar, I think COVID has also taught the media many, many new things. It's changed the landscape of media, and we can go into this, but I won't wrap it on now. But I would just like to say, amongst what I think is, I mean, you could call it positive, I don't know. It's anyway, a real lesson out of Myanmar is because of this huge attack on internet and access to the internet, what we're seeing is actually an incredible reversion to analog technologies. I mean, you know, suddenly I think at least up to 20 little mini newspapers have been produced just on one sheet of paper, being handed around. You know, there's a lot of people working on these things. And also, because of the cut to internet, people are starting to go back to SMS, old-fashioned text messages. There are people trying to do news services on SMS. And finally, pirate radio is, there's at least a couple of ingenious projects to set up FM radio, and now someone's talking about shortwave. So, you know, we thought the era of transistors was dead, but actually I wouldn't be surprised if soon you see a proliferation of transistor radios in Myanmar. So that's a really sort of, I was just thinking about that today, how it's a lesson, but particularly for, I'd hate to say it, us older people, it kind of does evoke the days, you know, we did actually start journalism in an era before even mobile phones, before the internet. And in some ways, it's amazing to see Myanmar, that any country could revert to these old-fashioned tactics today. Anyway, I'll leave you with that thought. I've got plenty of other ideas about positive things that have emerged.
Yeah, thanks for that, Gwen. And a follow-up question for you before we get to questions. How much has citizen journalism, or just average people with cell phone cameras out there filming things, been important for journalists to know what's going on in Myanmar and Thailand?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. And I'm glad you raised it. It was a point I wanted to make. It's been incredible in Thailand as well. I mean, it has completely altered, I think, the landscape. In some ways, it's raised the bar for conventional media because, you know, it was easy to do a report of a riot or a protest, but now, you know, basically citizen journalists have done a lot of the work. The images are out there. It forces you to go further and not just do a stream of the protest and talk to a few people. You've got to go further. Citizen journalists are doing incredible work, but most of all in Myanmar, where, I don't know, you only have to look at Twitter, and I don't know how these people are getting images out, but it's all out there, and incredible footage, and often footage of citizen journalists at work. So I'm watching, like, you know, someone recording with a mobile, I suppose, several young people, like, in the middle of, like, complete conflagration in the street, filming with their mobile phones up close, taking incredible risks. And, you know, it's almost like there's, these days, particularly as media is banned or going underground, it's very hard to tell the difference or define what is a citizen journalist and what is a journalist. A lot of the regular professional journalists are working for no pay. You know, there's things are running, people are running out of cash. So I think it sort of has blurred the lines of what is a citizen and what is a journalist. But they've been fundamental, and also in Thailand, fundamental, I'd say, and very brave.
fundamental and very brave. Before I move on and ask a couple of questions, let me give an update for our audience and for our panelists on what's happening here in Hong Kong. Obviously here, I think I would summarize it by saying we're suffering by a death by 1,000 cuts. Nothing major, but so many small things that have been coming along. For example, there's been a move at Radio Television Hong Kong, which is our public broadcaster here, where new management put on by the government has been going in and trying to basically rearrange programs. They've been canceling programs that the government here considers quote unquote unbalanced. They've been putting on new programs that considered more balanced, like a daily program by our chief executive. A Radio Television Hong Kong journalist has been charged and convicted for doing something what journalists here normally would do, which was using a public records search to search for vehicle records. In addition to that, there has been the arrest for multiple charges of the publisher of the Apple Daily, Jimmy Lai here. There has been an attack on the printing presses of Echo Times here. There has been a tightening of the media space in many different ways, and people here are worried about the discussions going on, first from the police, now from government officials around the chief executive about a fake news law, where they seem to be saying that now it should be criminalized to print so-called fake news, which we all know is a very vague term. It can mean anything that the government wants it to mean. Anything that government disagrees with can be considered fake news. So all of this has led to this kind of tightening of free expression here in Hong Kong. And just today, for Press Freedom Day, the Hong Kong Journalists Association has done a survey of its members who have said basically that they fear that the space for press freedom has been shrinking here in Hong Kong. And here in Hong Kong, with the Reporters Without Borders Index, Hong Kong has dropped to number 80, which is a very large drop for a country that or its territory that used to be considered near the top for press freedom. And so it's a very sad period for press freedom here in Hong Kong. Let me use that as a starting point for a question for each of you. Let me start with you, Ed. Are there fake news laws going on in where you know, or laws against kind of rumors or et cetera, or has this kind of Donald Trumpian version of what's fake news found its way into Indonesia yet?
I think this has really been covered by the Electronic Information and Transactions Law that actually has been around for quite a while. I think it's a sort of 2008 or something. And this is the one that has journalists more worried. I mean, it has very, very broad interpretation. It can be used for defamation, hate speech, and this is the one that I think there was Southeast Asia Freedom of Expression Network said that between 2016 and 2020, there were 786 cases involving this law, with 88% of those charged ending up behind bars. So, it's certainly, there's certainly been lots of calls from activists and journalists for it to be changed. And there is some talk about it now being implemented as fairly as possible, I think was the quote that Jokowi used. So there is some hope there, but it's certainly a powerful tool that can easily have a chilling effect.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Ate, in Cambodia, I've seen Hun Sen using this phrase "fake news" in recent years. I mean, is that still going on, or are there any laws that are being used or weaponized against journalists?
Yeah, the term is used quite often here in Cambodia. It's been over the past years, and we now also see that the government is working on a cybercrime law, which is also kind of vague and could be. We're not sure yet how they're going to interpret that one, but we are worried, of course, that cybercrime law itself. What is cybercrime exactly in the eyes of the government? But when it comes to fake news, we have seen quite a few people arrested over the past year, and I think it's gotten worse during COVID-19 pandemic, because there is a lot of, how to say it, there's been a lot of rumors in Cambodia, and there's a lot of I mean, that's in any country, I guess, but there is, and how to say it, and that is often leading to suspicions of fake news, or what others also mentioned, when the government doesn't like certain news, they consider it as fake news. And I think it's gotten worse during the pandemic, also because there's a bigger need for control, and control of information then especially. And then these laws are being used, and that happens quite frequently. We've seen a lot of dozens of journalists were threatened last year, and most of them Cambodian journalists. Some of them so-called Facebook journalists, which is basically the same as citizen journalists. And that happens. And some of them are being arrested. Some of them are being sent to jail because they report false news or fake news, or because the government says you are inciting to violence with what you are reporting. Yeah, it's a very real thing.
Mm-hmm. And Barnaby, same thing. I think I've heard Duterte, or at least people around him, use this phrase, this Trumpian phrase, fake news, before. How has that permeated the Filipino lexicon?
It's been thrown around a lot by all sides of the political spectrum. It's been thrown around by the government to accuse legitimate media of reporting fake news, even though it's not really fake news, but the truth that they don't want to admit as truth, critical reporting, considered as fake news by the government. But the flip side of that is the government hiring, and this has been, Facebook has proven this. Facebook has removed a couple of groups on its site that have been traced back to China, and that appear to have been working for the Philippine government, these troll armies. And then you have, of course, the known propagandists of the government who have been churning out propaganda material, and to the point where they're actually fake news from the time that President Rodrigo Duterte was just campaigning for the presidency until the time that he was already the president of the Philippines. And so it's both sides, really, accusing each other of proliferating fake news. So it's very common term that's being used here in the Philippines, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just make a point, Keith?
Yeah, please go ahead. Next to you, fake news.
It's really striking that they don't really use the term fake news here. Well, in Thailand, or I notice even in Myanmar, with the horrendous things the junta is doing, the tough new laws they brought in, they don't really use the word fake. It's more like spreading instability is a crime, right? So for any media that is accused of spreading it, but they're not saying that it's not whether it's true or not. It's simply reporting. So you could be reporting something true, but it is deemed to spread instability. So that's quite a distinction. You're not being accused of making it up. You're just being accused of reporting it as the effect or responsibility for the effect of spreading instability, which is rich coming from, regime that's struggling with a failed coup. But anyway, so that's quite a distinction. And of course, in Thailand as well. Sorry.
Yeah, Barnaby?
We've been called destabilizers as well.
Destabilizing.
Here in the Philippines, journalists and activists, and we've been called prostitutes.
All right.
In the early years.
That's very clever.
Very clever.
But also, I think in Vietnam, as well as probably Laos, but they've managed to keep the lid on things so tightly that in Laos you never hear about anything. But in Vietnam as well, these journalists are getting horrendous jail sentences. They're not being accused of fake or making things up. it's undermining the state, it's criticizing the state. They're not being accused of fabrication, whereas it seems the Philippines and other parts of Southeast Asia are being accused like that.
Yeah, I think just speaking for Hong Kong here, I think we've heard this phrase lately in the last few days or weeks being tossed around, fake news, seemingly without any understanding what it really means. Because in some instances, the police, for example, have used newspapers that have juxtaposed photographs, which they did not like, to say, oh, that's fake news, when in fact the photographs are actually real. So they're not actually explaining what exactly is fake. And they say, well, we have to have a law, we have to have some kind of regulations against fake news without actually defining what they consider fake. And in most cases, as we have seen in the past, fake is something that they don't like, or fake is something that puts them in a bad light, or fake is truthful reporting that they disagree with.
Exactly.
Yeah, so that is a huge problem. I think we want to get to a couple of questions here. We have one from Shabani, who was our host here from the Washington Post, who asked, how has the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, changed the media environment in places like Indonesia, like Cambodia, for example? Has there been an effort to control the narrative? Has there been an effort for governments to kind of control government journalists reporting on exposing how well or how badly they have controlled the pandemic? Who would like to take that? Well, the question was asked to Cambodia and Indonesia, but anyone who would like to take it. Cambodia,
Yes, I can definitely say something about that. I know that's a very relevant question here at the moment, because Cambodia is now in the midst of its biggest coronavirus outbreak so far. And what we see here in Phnom Penh is the epicenter of that pandemic, is that the government is very much trying to control the story, control the news, but at the same time, it is leading to a lot of social unrest. Let's say it like that, because some parts of the city have been under very strict lockdown, and where people complain that they don't have any food, and the government is basically denying that it is happening. While there are pictures and videos of people really showing that they don't have any food. And some of these areas are also shut down recently for journalists who want to go there. And what is happening then is that the government is also trying to, and that happens very often in Cambodia, the government is trying to accuse the opposition for that. Because Cambodia has an opposition, mainly meaning CNRP, Sam Rainsy, and accusing him of inciting unrest and inciting those people to protest against the government that they don't have any food, no money, and no aid. While the government is basically saying, well, these people, we do help these people. And in that sense, the government is really very hard trying to control the narrative of this pandemic, which is very difficult for them, because we have the social media and these pictures and videos are coming out anyway.
Mm-hmm. And Ed, Indonesia, any thoughts on that?
I think early on in the pandemic, the government health ministers said there weren't any cases in Indonesia, put it down to prayer and other factors. And I think this was in a country which had direct flights from Wuhan. So that didn't last very long. And I think right at the beginning as well, that there was criticism that there was an attempt to manage it by not declaring all the cases initially. I think it's got a bit better now, but yes, at different times there has been criticism about the narrative, and at the same time, the government has sometimes felt, I think, that the media doesn't portray when things have changed and only focus on the bad areas of the pandemic. But that's news.
And how about in the Philippines? Has there been any questions about the media coverage of the pandemic and COVID and the government response?
Absolutely. I mean, the government has daily press briefings that not only the state channel airs, but all commercial channels and cable news channels air. And in these briefings, we're asked to submit our questions in advance. And if your question doesn't get picked, then it doesn't get answered. And very rare that we get to also follow up with more questions, the answers to the questions that we submit. And this is not just for the Palace press briefing. This is for the Health Department press briefing as well. We're asked to submit our questions, as early as 24 hours before the briefing. And sometimes, of course, things happen between the time that they ask us to submit the questions and the press briefing. And so we want to ask more questions, but they would only read the questions that they would like to read and they would like to answer. So that really affects our reporting, I would say, because we don't get to ask the critical questions. And there were a couple of instances actually where the palace spokesperson cut off female journalists in particular while they were asking their questions. And the palace spokesperson blamed internet connection. Well, but the journalists who did not get to finish asking their questions would not accept this excuse. At that time, they really pushed back. And the one good thing about that was that everybody in the Palace Press Corps pushed back against this, this act by the Palace spokesperson.
Well, thank you for that. And Gwen, same question, COVID and this question about fake news or attacks by government.
I'm glad you asked that. Extreme sensitivity here in Thailand anyway about any perception of criticism of COVID management. You can understand why. In some ways, Thailand is in a far more difficult position than some governments in the huge reliance the country has on tourism. So any criticism suggesting that Thailand has been less than competent on managing COVID is taken not just extremely personally, but as a hit on that is going to further undermine international confidence in the country amongst potential tourists to come back. But I think you could divide it broadly into several key strands there on this issue of media reporting of COVID management of governments. And one is the basic thing about truth and numbers. Is there any sort of inferences that maybe the government's being economical with the numbers or not testing as much as they should and trying to hide that fact? And I think the other key thing is really the actual management of the COVID cases. And then the third thing, most of all is the whole, politics of it, which here in Thailand has been extremely sensitive because it is linked with a situation where, let's just say that there is certain royal involvement in the vaccine rollout, including a huge project a big dream of Thailand to produce its own vaccine in a joint venture that was made with AstraZeneca. So Thailand is trying to produce its own. Funnily enough, that project has, let's just say it's not going very well. And because a lot of planning was pinned on this project, it actually has probably screwed up Thailand's vaccine response. And I think this is another area of vulnerability for journalists in the region, that governments are not going to take very kindly to any suggestion that they have screwed up after this phase of COVID management, which is vaccine procurement, vaccine rollout. But in Thailand, it has actually led incredibly to a less majest charge against both a popular opposition figure, Thanatorn, who raised these allegations, or this is a problem, in an interview with the BBC Thailand, and also the BBC in Thai language service. So that has been a huge issue, and it did show how, the whole COVID situation for media can get so political. And obviously in Myanmar, we have this incredible situation where people are being killed on the streets, but the junta is now trumpeting its great triumph of getting in more vaccines kindly provided by China, and about 70 members of the community lined up to accept the largesse of Myanmar's junta in giving out vaccines. So there are vaccine politics being played in Myanmar, but again, how that's being reported can actually in Myanmar land a journalist in jail or worse.
I like the way you say royal involvement. We'll leave it at that. But
well, people can read.
And if you have
AstraZeneca and Thailand.
AstraZeneca, Thailand, royal involvement. We don't say anymore here. But if you have a question, a quick question, singular at fcchk.org. A question from Eric Wishart. He just asked if anyone wants to jump on and grab this. Is there anything the U.S. administration, the new Biden administration, can or should do after all these years of Donald Trump encouraging Duterte and others to attack journalists and fake news? What should the U.S. be doing right now? I'm sure we've got some people from the consulate here in Hong Kong listening attentively, taking notes. Anyone want to grab that one? Yes, go ahead.
Give asylum to Myanmar media.
Yeah, absolutely. And anybody else? What should the U.S. administration be doing after all these years?
I think even during the administration of Donald Trump, there were already members of the U.S. Senate who had expressed their support for Maria Ressa. And to an extent, they had also expressed their support for Senator Laila de Lima, who is one of the senators here in the Philippines who has been jailed since, if I'm not mistaken, 2017 for basically opposing President Rodrigo Duterte's war on drugs. She's been accused of getting involved in the drug trade when she was Justice Secretary. This was the accusation that was hurled by President Duterte and his people in Congress, and now she's in jail. But just back to Maria Ressa, she's gotten a lot of support from the U.S. and not just from senators and Congress people in the U.S., but journalist organizations in the U.S., human rights organizations. But I think a lot of the support, I'm not saying that it's a bad thing that there's this show of support for Maria Ressa, but I think there's a lack of support for other journalists who are also suffering here in the Philippines. I mentioned journalists who have been jailed. I mentioned a lot of journalists who have been killed in the 5 years of President Rodrigo Duterte's presidency. But in fact, these killings have been happening for years. 30 journalists were killed during the time of former President Aquino. And of course, there were more journalists killed during the time of Gloria Arroyo by virtue of just the 32 who were killed in one day. So I think while I think the Filipinos do appreciate the support for Maria Ressa, I think that a lot more journalists here in the Philippines need that kind of international support as well.
Thank you for that. A couple of quick questions coming in. One from to any panelist who wants to answer. They're asking, and actually this is from our colleague Patrick Lee in Malaysia, from the foreign correspondents there, who is asking if any of you are seeing issues of work visas not being renewed for foreign correspondents on your patch. They had something involving an Al Jazeera journalist involving there. Have any of you seen the visa being used, weaponized in your areas?
Yes, can I answer that? Because
yes, please. Gwen first.
this is becoming a huge issue in Thailand, actually. In fact, every year the bar has been sort of raised for renewal of press credentials, and in particular in the last year, it's mainly, well, it's for all media actually, but there's also been extra provisions, and it's been much harder for freelance journalists who aren't full staff for an organization, even if they have a sponsoring organization. But for all journalists, including staff reporters, things like, you know, you used to have to submit 5 published articles over a year for renewal. That has to be 10. And for freelancers, that can be very difficult, especially if they're people who produce maybe 1 a month. So there's that. And then they added this demand suddenly for certificate to prove you do not have a criminal record in your home country. Well, actually, a lot of embassies do not do that. So that was really becoming an issue. So, you know, there's a lot of provisions. The recent one was to have a COVID test. And in fact, very few other categories of foreigner has to have a COVID test to renew their visa, or at least didn't have to. I don't know if it's changed in the last month, but when I asked who has to have a COVID test to renew their visa, I was told it was Myanmar, Cambodian and Lao migrant workers and journalists. So that was one. And so that was not a quote from the Foreign Ministry, that was from the hospitals giving the COVID test. But anyway, so it does look like the space is shrinking again for you know, easy renewal of, well, it was never easy, but it's getting harder. I think that might lead to reduced numbers of freelancers, in particular in Thailand, and maybe that's exactly what the government might want to see.
And maybe what the government wants to see. Anyone else on that? Or otherwise, I have another quick question.
Yes, can I share about what we have here?
Yes, go right ahead.
Okay, thank you. Because when it comes to visas, that's not really a problem in Cambodia, and not even when it comes to getting a press card. However, what we are seeing now is, with this pandemic, is that the government is asking journalists to apply for a travel permit, so that journalists can still travel during the lockdown, and that is getting quite complicated, and can be complicated to apply for that. It's not always clear where you have to apply for it. It's always not always clear who's getting it, and then it seems very much like pro-government are getting it much easier than independent journalists or freelancers. That is a concern here that we currently really have.
Thank you. And we have a little bit of time left. I'll ask you to all be a little bit quick. Christy Lou Stout is asking the question here. With all this pressure going on, what kind of emotional toll is this taking on journalists that you know about? I mean, being constantly harassed, under threat, et cetera. Do you know any? Can you comment? Can any of you comment on the emotional or physical toll this is taking on journalists who have to continuously go out and report the news? Ed, you know, can you mention anything?
I mean, I think
yes.
what is very marked is, I mean, covering Myanmar right now, people, even if they're not on the ground or on the ground, are looking at images every day, every hour, which, you know, is taking a huge toll, and that's without even being there. So I mean, it's going to have an enormous impact, I think, on mental health going forward. So yeah, that would be my sort of one, that on top of the pandemic, having to deal with such violence is enormous.
Yes, Gwen.
Yeah, we're seeing, you know, Myanmar journalists getting in here now, quite a few. And I'd say that quite a few have, you know, signs of trauma, or possibly even PTSD in some cases. It's extreme what has been going on in Myanmar. But I think also in Thailand, it does have a huge toll on those who are in the front line. So it's hard to say in what ways, except I think some just either give up or, you know, the intimidation does get too much. Others just keep going, but I think that there is a toll. On foreign correspondence, perhaps, you know, I don't know. I mean, the bar around the Foreign Correspondence Club before we had to lock down again was as you know, boozy as ever. So I think they're probably still just continuing to deal with their coping mechanisms are in.
The coping mechanisms of foreign correspondence are still resilient.
Used to be totally dry now.
It has traditionally always been. We're almost out of time. Before I let you all go, I'm going to go in order. Ed, Ate, Barnaby, and then Gwen. I'm going to ask you all one last question that I know you were not prepared for, but please tell our audience here, what book are you reading, or what book can you recommend that our members read? What are you reading now? Ed, what are you reading?
Goodness, you totally caught me out on that one.
Don't you hate Keith's surprise question?
I should have warned you.
I have a pile of books that I've been meaning to start, and then various huge stories started. So I'm hoping to get back to them, but I can wander over because they're in the corner and pick one in a second.
You're allowed to take a pass. No worries. Ate, what are you reading? Or what do you recommend our members read?
I just finished the History of Burma by Chan Nguyen-U, if I say it correctly. Yes, that's a really good book. I can really recommend that. And I have the new book of Sebastian Strangio waiting for me about the influence of China on Southeast Asia, which is probably going to be really interesting.
Barnaby, you're on. What are you reading?
I've started reading 2 books that my friends have written, so I have to read them because those 2 books were written by friends. The 2 books are actually about the siege in Marawi in the southern Philippines back in 2017, and I covered that from start to end. So it's very interesting for me to be reading these 2 books. Unfortunately, I've not finished either of the book. And there is another book waiting for me. It's called Some Days You Can't Save Them All by a doctor at the Philippine General Hospital, which is the main COVID hospital here in the Philippines.
Gwen Robinson, I know you have a huge stack of books next to your bed, but I want to know, what are you reading right now and what do you recommend?
Wow. Well, I am reading a new novel by Lawrence Osborne on Thailand called The Glass Palace or Glass House. Sorry, don't get me. I've got it right. It's Glass House, I think. Anyway, it's set in Bangkok against the backdrop of the earlier 70s protest movement. But I don't find it's not actually relaxing when you're reading about things that. And similarly, I am rereading like Ajay Tan Min Oo's Secret History of Burma, partly because neither of those are very relaxing, I have to say. So I do have some more recreational reading. A friend gave me a book called The Dalai Lama's Cat for my birthday.
Excellent. I'm reading The Rebel of Rangoon by Delphine Schrank, and I'm reading Fareed Zakaria's book, 10 Lessons for a Post-Pandemic World. Thank you all. Thank you, Ed Davies. Thank you, Ate Hoekstra. Thank you, Barnaby Lowe. Thank you, Gwen Robinson. Thank you, Shabani Matani, for hosting us today. Thank you, everybody, our excellent team here at the FCC HK for putting this together. Benny, the man behind the camera. If you missed this, you wouldn't be watching us now, but otherwise, we're going to be on YouTube. This thing will be repeated over and over and over and again. It will live on forever. I want to thank all the panelists. Thank you. Let's do this again for all of our correspondence clubs. We love you guys. We're all part of the same club here. We're all part of the same struggle. Let's stay together. Peace, love. I love you guys all. Let's do this again together. We are all in the same struggle for press freedom around the world. Happy Press Freedom Day, if I can say that. Again, thank you very much. We'll see you all later. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bella.
Bye.